Hi, I'm Benjamin Payne. At the K-12 Education Office at Hillsdale College, we support school founding groups and their efforts to start classical schools across the country. Finding the right leader is one of the first and most important steps to building a successful school. While we do consider experience in education, we seek candidates who exhibit unwavering personal integrity, honesty, courage, and servant-hearted leadership. Perhaps that's you. If you're looking to engage in fulfilling, impactful, and challenging work protecting our nation's future and building up the next generation of virtuous citizens, we'd love to hear from you. I'm looking for strong school leaders right now. Learn more about how you can make a difference at hillsdale.edu/leader. hillsdale.edu/LEADER. That's hillsdale.edu/leader.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by Dr. Jonathan Gregg. He is Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College. Dr. Gregg, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Chatting today about state testing. Why are we even talking about this subject, standardized tests? It seems somewhat antithetical to classical education.
That's a great question, Scott. I feel like I need to start this segment with a confession that I'm actually becoming a little bit pro-standardized test. And I think that may come as a shock to a number of people in the classical education world, because in some ways the classical education movement is a response to a high-stakes testing culture that actually distracts from the true telos of education, which is learning. And if you make it about test preparation and passing tests, and that's the culture that we have, then learning kind of goes out the window. And I think that to some extent that's still true. I'm still not going to go knock on doors to bang the drum of state tests. And I think there's a number of problematic things with standardized exams, funding that gets tied to them, evaluation that gets tied to them, and the real problematic thing about how the classroom becomes a place to prepare for tests rather than a place of wisdom and virtue and learning. And those things are still problematic. But as I'm looking around at this post-truth world that we live in, where any kind of standards are starting to be thrown out the window, and we're starting to see the systematic lowering of standards because any kind of truth is becoming oppressive. And so for me to tell you what maybe would be worth learning is oppressive to the student, I think I'm moving back the other direction. I think I'm starting to say that, hey, there are some things that are worth learning, and there are some things that are worth learning for us all. And if that means having a test to hold up some kind of a standard, I think that seems to align a little bit with the emphasis on truth that classical education is aligned with. And so I'm not saying that standardized exams are the best way to do that, but I think as far as holding up some kind of a truth-based standard, I think that's something that I can get on board with. And I think it does tend to be somewhat countercultural, weirdly enough, in the world that we live in.
So for those who aren't familiar, what are these standardized tests like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to use the mathematics ones. I think those ones are maybe the easier ones for folks to grasp. But I think that, as you might remember, and as anyone who's familiar with them, the standardized tests are pretty difficult. And they're intentionally trying to be a little bit tricky. They're intentionally trying to subvert student expectations. They're intentionally trying to challenge students in a number of ways. I mean, take a very basic example. I'm pulling a third grade math test here where the question says, it gives you a set of numbers that have been rounded already. So they said it's been rounded to the nearest 100, it's been rounded to the nearest 1,000. Give us an example of an original number, or the original number before it was rounded. And so imagine you're a student taking these tests. You've done rounding till you're blue in the face, but you're almost always given a number and asked to round it and asked to estimate it, right? This is why we normally do rounding is we do it that way. We do it so that we can ballpark a figure. And so what they're doing is they're taking an example of a normal question and they're flipping it on its head, which is going to be difficult to the student. Notice that there's multiple right answers to that question, which a student might not be familiar with, and it's no matter how much rounding you've done, that's always going to mess with you a little bit, and so you're going to have to deal with that type of complexity. There's going to be challenges in the language that's used. So I'm looking at an example of a 5th grade question that has in a single question sequence, transformations, figures, similar, congruent, rotation, translation, dilation, reflection, where think about as a 5th grader how you have to have how much mastery you have to have over that subject to have the command of that kind of language. And it's not going they're not trying to make these things easy on students. They are, if you think about you're a test writer and you have maybe 60 standards to fit into 25 questions, you're going to have to necessarily fit multiple standards into every question. And so this isn't going to be students doing a single problem that they've seen before that's on one isolated idea. This is going to be high-level problem solving, dealing with unfamiliar language, bringing multiple concepts together on a single problem. It's not an easy task. Even for the most well-prepared students, this is going to, it's set up to be a particularly challenging task to overcome.
If the questions are asked in a unusual or strange way, and the test itself is meant to be challenging for almost any student at a grade level, what insights can we glean from the results?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's limited insights that you can gain towards what kind of whether good teaching is showing up in the classroom. I think if you have, you could totally imagine a student who's actually having a very good mathematics education, who's learning, who's growing in their ability, and really progressing at some kind of a rate that we might consider acceptable, to go on a test and really either have a bad day or encounter something that's unfamiliar, or really the thing that I've seen most with students is they'll get a question that they think they can handle that requires some sort of perseverance, actually, or requires some sort of time investment. I'm thinking in particular of a question that says, the question is, assume you are working with whole numbers. Which of the following is not possible? 2 numbers have a sum of 18 and a product of 72, a sum of 25 and a product of 100, a sum of 19 and a product of 96, a sum of 25 and a product of 144. And there is a quick way to do this problem, but it's a high-level concept. And the other way to do this problem is to factor out all the numbers, to guess and check, to look at all the possible sums and multiples. And if I'm a student who, in my math class, who is actually a perseverant student who has the virtue of perseverance, right? I would expect them to do the work to solve that problem, but it's going to take them 30 minutes. And so are they going to have time to do all the other questions? They're not. And so actually someone who is doing what we would hope a student would do when they encounter that problem is actually going to do worse on a standardized test than someone who is encountering that and says, well, I'm just going to guess on this one and skip to the next one because I know this is going to take me half an hour, right? It's a practical choice, and so you might call that a study skill, but in reality, the test in some ways runs counter to some of the virtues that we want to see in the classroom. And so to use a standardized exam as an evaluation metric for a teacher or an evaluation metric for a student, really, you might get some results overall, but for a single student or a single teacher, that's a really tough ask, because in some ways, the test itself obscures some of the virtues that we would really love to see in students.
Are different states dealing with different tests, different requirements? I actually have maybe this is a reflection on what I do in my free time, looked at some of these different standardized tests in different states, and while they're similar, they still are different tests in each state.
That's true. There's been some movements to try to unify some states under some different exams, but the reality of the situation is it's pretty complex, and different states are dealing with different political factors in the background that are driving them either towards one another or away from one another. And so there are very few standardized tests that run across the nation. There's a couple, but not. But in the reality, the reality of the situation is, if you're looking to prepare for an exam, you really have to be familiar with your own state's policies. The good news is a lot of states will be very clear about the kinds of things they are going to have on their tests, and have some examples of questions that you can find online. So it's not a mystery of what's going to show up necessarily, but it is something that it's hard to sit here and make blanket recommendations because of the fact that each state is going to run everything a little bit differently.
Dr. Jonathan Gregg is with us, Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College, as we talk about state testing. With all of this complexity out there, what can it take to actually do well, perform well on these exams?
I think this is where I start to get into some of the good news here, which it sounds weird to frame this as good news, but if I think about the actual virtues that are going to cause a student to do well on an exam, and I'm drawing on students that I know have done well on exams, as well as just kind of general classroom practices, the good news is you can't possibly be prepared for all of the content, language, and forms that you're going to see on an exam, right? The test is designed to obscure those things. And so it would be ridiculous to spend all of my time in a classroom test prepping, right? And to distort my own curriculum, to distort some of the other goals that I would have for a classroom. But what are the virtues in a student that's going to do really well, right? Number one, I think the confidence to work through complex and unfamiliar situations. And so because they know they're not going to get something that they're going to be familiar with, right? Even if you have taught them that thing, you might have taught them that in September, and now it's March and they're taking the test, right? So it's going to be unfamiliar, but the willingness to try things, the perseverance to know what to do when things get difficult, the ability to have the number sense, to have the red flag when the answer feels a little bit off. Number two, I think the ability to use context clues to infer truths, especially about unfamiliar language, about unfamiliar forms. Number three, I think the creativity, the imagination to remain flexible and devise a strategy to attack a problem. And then number four, I think this having some sort of single overarching strategy that applies to a number of problems that I can rely on, such as drawing a picture, where this is something that no matter what problem I get, maybe I'm confused about it, but let's just start drawing a picture. Let's just try to model this problem. And so those are the kinds of things that I think are going to be the virtues that we want to see in students who do well in tests. And the good news that I can't help but think is these are some of the exact virtues we want to see in our students in classical education in general, right? We want to see creativity. We want to see imagination. We want to see confidence. We want to see number sense. We want to see this ability to model. We want to see the flexibility to use context clues to infer truths. These are not anti-classical education goals, right? And so ideally, and I know this is ideal, right? We have yet to get into some of the real practical questions of this, but ideally, if we're accomplishing the goals that we want to accomplish in classical education with our students, they are going to be prepared for these exams. And so test prep is actually just good classical pedagogy, where the more you're able to do the kind of teach. Now, I don't think that's the entirety of the solution, but it's actually, we should, if we're teaching well in classical schools, be raising up a generation of students who should do pretty well on these tests because they have the exact virtues that are required to do well.
If we do get more practical, how might you advise a school to prepare students for the tests without letting that preparation overwhelm the primary goals of a classical education classroom or take over the curriculum for a week or so?
Right. I think this is a really good question, where the advice that I'd have is don't teach to the test, but use the test to teach. And that's a little bit of a pithy recommendation, but to get a little bit more practical here, I think you have to It's a twofold goal here, right? Where number one, I think we do want to expose students to more and more content, more form, more language that they are going to see on the exam in the hopes that they'll run into some questions that they're familiar with, or at least generally familiar with. But two, to help them to know what to do when things are not familiar, to help them to know what happens when they get some unfamiliar language, content, form. And so I think number one, that every classical school teacher, maybe over the summer, maybe some professional development, should go and take the test themselves. Usually you can find a practice one online, but just to see what's familiar about it, right? Just to see what the kinds of things that are going to show up in March. And so if there is a specific, take the rounding question that I mentioned earlier, if there is that question that's going to show up in the exam in March potentially, why wouldn't you give that to them when they're doing a rounding lesson in during the course of the regular school year, where it's not a bad question. It's something that you could totally throw at your students, teach through it, have them practice it, have them try it one time. I'm not rearranging the entire curriculum. I'm not punting all the things that I'm trying to do. It's just a sticky note that I can put on my lesson plan that says, oh, ask this when this is here, right? And I think this kind of low-hanging fruit to say, let's expose students to this so that the teachers can just be a little bit more familiar with the test. Number two, I think using some actual test questions, and almost every state has a sample test bank that you can pull from. Using actual test questions as maybe a 10-minute math challenge for students sometime in the afternoon, maybe every Friday. You have a math challenge. Don't tell them it's state test prep, right? Just say math challenge and put it up on the board and have the students, maybe in pairs, maybe individually, try that problem. Right? And then teach it with good classical pedagogy. Ask the kinds of questions that we want to ask normally in our classrooms. What's hard about this problem? What don't we know? Is there something we do know? Are there answers that don't make sense? Does my answer make sense? Am I on the right track? How do you know? What was the key moment in figuring this out? What if it were a little different? All of these just good classical pedagogy questions you can ask about those state test questions. The goal is you actually want the question to be a little bit unfamiliar to them. You don't want to have prepared them for it because that's not how they're going to encounter it on the test. They're not going to encounter it as something they prepared. They're going to encounter it as something unfamiliar to them. And so doesn't take any prep work on the part of the teacher. You just throw it up on the whiteboard and say, go, math challenge. And maybe you do a second one that's kind of like it, but spend 10 minutes. And if you do that over the course of a year, you get through maybe 40. You get through one of each of the state test questions from the previous year, and you're not compromising your classical pedagogy. You're using it as kind of a math challenge in the afternoon that encourages students to grapple with things they haven't seen, that encourages them to get outside their comfort zone, that provides a challenge, that gives them new words and new vocabulary, but also that helps them to say, oh, I'm not familiar with this. What do I do when I'm not familiar with something? How can I develop some study skills? How can I eliminate some easy answers, some wrong answers? How can I make educated guesses? These are the kind of things that you can teach in those moments where you're putting these math questions on the board just as a challenge for students. And then lastly, I would say just making sure we're encouraging our students when they are being confident and bold and trying to overcome these challenges. So create a really positive environment. I think a lot of state test prep is pretty high stakes, high stress. And so just to say, hey, these are just fun challenge problems that I think students perform a lot better when they are in that type of environment. And I think you can affirm them for some of the boldness and the confidence to try something that's a little bit unfamiliar to them is going to serve them well, just as we're trying to raise up students with wisdom and virtue.
High stakes, high stress. Do we want to say anything to the students ahead of actually taking these tests? Do we want to say, hey, this is really important, or hey, this is going to be challenging, have some fun, do your best? What kind of maybe verbal instructions to prepare the students for the actual test taking?
Yeah, great question. I would definitely lean towards the latter. I think I don't think this is going to be surprising to too many people out there, but I think there's a whole host of data to say that students do better even when they're feeling positive and confident than when they're feeling afraid. And to say nothing of the fact that we always want a test to be something that is this is going to sound a little cheesy, but I mean it in the best way possible. A celebration of learning, where you've learned this thing. Now is the chance to show us, right? And if you can't do a question, that's part of the learning process. And so I don't think I would change my language in any way when I'm talking to students about state exams, where this is, we've done some preparation for it. We've learned over the course of the semester. Now you get to answer some questions to show it. It's not a big deal. It's something that is that you should still try your best on. I don't think I would hope our students would be willing to try their best on that thing. But I don't think you need to add any extra pressure intensity to the exam.
Dr. Jonathan Gregg is Assistant Professor of Education at Hillsdale College. As we talk about state testing, Dr. Gregg, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Thanks, Scott.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. That's Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.